HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Debatable Land, The Lost World Between Scotland and England, by Robb, read by Saul Reichlin.
Part 1. Chapter 1. Hidden Places. Early one evening in the autumn of 2010, my wife Margaret and I stood in front of Carlisle railway station in the far northwest of England with 2 loaded bicycles and a one-way ticket from Oxford. After 23 years in the south, we had decided to move to Scotland. The idea was to live closer to my mother, her son and daughter-in-law becoming every day a more distant memory, and to find a home more conducive to those 2 inseparable pursuits, writing and cycling. By chance, our search had ended just short of Scotland, at a lonely house on the very edge of England. The title deed showed that we would own a stretch of the national border. If Scotland regained its independence, which seemed a remote prospect, we would be custodians of an international frontier. During our last months in Oxford, I had read about our future home and discovered that the river, which almost surrounds the house, had once marked the southern boundary of a region called the Debatable Land. For several centuries, this desolate tract, running northeast from the Solway Firth, had served as a buffer between the 2 nations. Within those 50 square miles, by parliamentary decrees issued in both countries in 1537 and 1551, all Englishmen and Scottishmen are and shall be free to rob, burn, spoil, slay, murder, and destroy all and every such person and persons, their bodies, property, goods, and livestock, without any redress to be made for same. By all accounts, they availed themselves of the privilege. Under Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, James V, and James VI, the Debatable Land had been the bloodiest region in Britain. Finding out about the area as it exists today had proved surprisingly difficult. The name on the postal address, a collective term for a scattering of small settlements and isolated farms, seemed to refer to a mythical place. It was missing entirely from a book titled The Hidden Places of Cumbria, 1990. Even the long valley in which it lies had remained invisible to the author. When, a few weeks after moving, I mentioned the name of the place to a Carlisle taxi driver, a faraway look appeared in his eyes. "I've heard of it," he said, as though I was asking to be driven to a place out of legend. Those days of first contact with the borderlands now seemed to belong to a distant past. I had no idea how much there was to be explored, and no intention of writing a book about the place in which we had found a home. The history of the area was a threadbare tapestry, on which scenes of fruitless chaos in a derelict realm were monotonously depicted. The border itself was little more than a quaint memento of the Anglo-Scottish Wars, and there were few signs that it would rise from the enormous burial mound of British history, proclaiming its ancient identity like a sleeping knight to whom life, but not memory, had been restored. Then, under the powerful spell of idle curiosity, documents and maps arrived unbidden. The land and its inhabitants seemed to have become aware that someone was taking an interest in them. The story unfolded itself between 2010 and 2016, and the independent territory, which used to exist between Scotland and England, began to look like a crucial missing piece in the puzzle of British history. It was towards the end of that period, when the United Kingdom was entering a new and unpredictable world, that I made the 2 discoveries described in the last part of this book. One was a 2nd-century atlas of Iron Age and Roman Britain, so wonderfully accurate that it could still be used today. The other was the earliest account of a major historical event in Britain from a British point of view. The past, too, then seemed to dissolve and reshape itself, and the existence of those ancient documents would have seemed fantastic were it not for the tangible reality of their revelations. The country in miniature, known as the Debatable Land, came to the attention of the outside world in the 16th century. Surveyors were sent from London to explore and chart its moors and meadows, its plains and wooded gorges, its bogs and hidden glens. 50 years later, when most of its population was slaughtered or deported, it became the last part of Great Britain to be conquered and brought under the control of a state. The Debatable Land, a name it acquired in the last 2 centuries of its existence, is the oldest detectable territorial division in Great Britain. Its roots lie in an age when neither England nor Scotland, nor even the Roman Empire, could be imagined. At the height of its notoriety, it preoccupied the monarchs and parliaments of England, Scotland, and France. Today, though some of its boundaries survive as sections of the national border, it has vanished from the map, and no one knows exactly where and what it was. This book, which I had never expected to write, now seems almost too slender to encompass that magically expanding realm. From its northernmost point, 1,000 feet above sea level, to the great estuary into which all its becks, burns, gills, sykes, and waters flow, the Debatable Land measures only 13 miles. The widest crossing is 8.5 miles, and it can be circumambulated, with difficulty, in 2 days. There are 3 ranges of hills, 1 mountain, and when the tide is in, a mile of coastline. A main artery of the British road system passes through it, yet it is quite possible to spend a long day walking across it without seeing another human being, even in the distance. In that emptiness, paths stretch far back in time. For several years I explored every corner of the medieval Debatable Land. I saw in its ruins the remnants of an older civilization, and I knew that this unique survivor of a maligned society had fostered the formation of a united kingdom. But the mystery of its origins remained intact until those 2 chance discoveries relaunched the expedition. These treasures have implications for a much wider world, but the keys to their decipherment and their long-term significance belong to the Debatable Land. The light of the border fells, which can suddenly illumine a hidden valley when the rest of the landscape is in darkness, gives even the most extraordinary discovery the air of a natural occurrence. Yet it still seems a wonder to have found in the remotest past of the Anglo-Scottish frontier a path which led back to the present. Chapter 2. Outpost. Travellers arriving in the border city of Carlisle on the northbound train are likely to be taken unawares. One moment there is a view of scraggly sheep chomping at the foot of a dry stone wall as they shelter from the horizontal rain. A moment later, without the warning of any noticeable suburb, the train is pulling into the airy gloom of a Victorian Gothic railway station, and there is just enough time to untether the bicycles and rescue the luggage from the rack. 100 years ago, a train was approaching Carlisle station from the opposite direction. This was the night express from Scotland, due to arrive in London the following morning. In one of the compartments, a newly married couple was staring out at the black night of the borderlands, watching for the first signs of England. The bulk of a great castle rose on the left, and the station lights glimmered up ahead. Lowering the window, the bridegroom leaned out to shout his joy, probably hoping to startle any Englishman who might be standing on the platform. The station roof was in no better repair than when I first saw it in 2010. A steel cable had become detached from the gantries. Its sagging loop snagged the shouting Scotsman. His body slumped onto the floor of the compartment, and a severed head leapt onto the seat, leaving the young bride in a gruesome tete-a-tete with her late husband, as the train screamed on towards the dark Cumbrian fells. No trace of this unhappy incident can be found in any newspaper of the time. The story might have been invented to explain the headless ghost which is occasionally seen in the undercroft of Carlisle Station, built in 1847, on a slum clearance area called the Fever Pit. This sounds like a specimen of North Cumbrian humour served up to tourists who expect to hear tales of cross-border conflict. English patriots exulting at the mishaps of loud-mouthed haggis-eaters, or kilted clansmen wreaking romantic revenge on the stout and stuck-up yeomanry of England. Anyone who leaves Carlisle Station on a Saturday night, when the pubs of Botchergate are disgorging their clientele, stands a reasonable chance of witnessing some inter-tribal violence. The border lies just a few miles to the north at Gretna, and Carlisle is the only significant urban centre between Newcastle, 60 miles to the east, and Dumfries, 35 miles to the west. But the battles in the streets of Carlisle are rarely between Scots and English. A few extended local families preserve the traditions of feuding border clans, but the frightened faces, pressed up against a taxi driver's window, begging to be rescued from a gathering mob, are more likely to be those of lads from Furness, the coastal part of Cumbria, where they say "me mare" instead of "me mate." Cumbria's tribal map is as complex as its history. Carlisle itself once belonged to Scotland, as quite a few English people still believe to be the case, which is why the Domesday Book of 1086 contains no mention of Carlisle. A great many other books contain no mention of Carlisle. It may be the capital and only city of the county of Cumbria, and the former western command centre of Hadrian's Wall, but with its population of 73,000, Carlisle is a poor relation to the famous, poet-celebrated Lake District, which has an annual tourist population of 16 million. After a municipal reassessment of the city's economic potential, a forlorn sign on the station platform now proclaims the border city to be the City of the Lakes. But most tourists from the south will have alighted long before at Oxenholme or Penrith. The standing water in the vicinity of Carlisle consists mainly of brackish ponds, slurry lagoons, and, with increasing frequency, floodwater, which submerges a large part of the modern city, leaving the medieval districts high and dry, and inducing the long-suffering burghers of Carlisle to rebrand it the City of the Lake. That evening in 2010, as we stood in front of the station, dazed by the long journey and a sense of the irreparable, Carlisle itself looked like the last place in England. From there it would be a ride of almost 20 miles to the house, which is why we had booked a room at the county hotel. It stared at us with its flaking facade from the other side of a car-clogged square, beyond the iron railings of a disaffected public toilet. The bicycles might have been stowed in the removal van, which was travelling overnight, but a bus ran only twice a week, and only to within 2 miles of the house, and the railway, known as the Waverley Line, which once connected Carlisle with Edinburgh, had been closed for 40 years. Its closure had transformed an area of 1,000 square miles into a vast backwater. One roadless settlement, Reichlin, had been entirely cut off. The only noticeable economic advantage was the depressing effect on house prices. The sign at the hotel entrance suggested that in some respects it was a popular venue. Antisocial behaviour will not be tolerated. The hotel appeared to have been partially renovated in the 1960s, and its prices were correspondingly reasonable. An hour later, we were sitting in a vast bedroom overlooking the Spartan leisure zone of Botchergate. In the days when the long journey from London forced businessmen and dignitaries to spend the night in Carlisle, it might have been considered palatial. One of the removal men, a native from North Cumbria, had told us that the small town we would pass through next day on our way to the house was known locally as Dodge City. With its decor of red velours and tasselled armchairs, the room reminded me of a brothel above a Wild West saloon. From the street below came bellowings in an unfamiliar dialect. After dinner I went for a stroll and passed between the two squat towers of the 19th century citadel, which replicates the old southern defences of the city. A plaque on the wall commemorated the last public execution in Carlisle, 15th March 1862. An engine driver called Charlton had murdered an old widow at a nearby railway crossing with a pickaxe and a hedge slasher, and robbed her of the money she had saved up for her funeral. Beyond the citadel lay the main shopping area, English Street, then Scotch Street. I walked as far as the bridge over the River Eden until I could see the road leading north to the Border Fells and Scotland. A cold wind was blowing from the north. This would mean an extra early start in the morning. It was not yet 10 o'clock, and a restaurant was already closing its doors. I reflected that from now on this would be our nearest centre of civilization. The shop windows hinted at a lack of disposable income, and the city was as dimly lit as it must have been in the age of gas lamps. The narrow vennels on either side were impenetrable to the eye, but there was no sign of any antisocial behaviour, which was not surprising, since the place was almost deserted. I turned to go back to the hotel, trying to interpret the feeling of dread as the thrill of adventure. Something in particular made it impossible to forget that we were a long way from the south of England. The few people who passed in the street looked me in the eye and wished me good evening, as though, as far as they were concerned, I already belonged to their world. At dawn the following morning, we cycled across the Eden and pedalled up to the ridge on which the Romans had built the fort of Axelodonum. Green mountains appeared to the north, and suddenly I felt an air of childhood holidays. The wind must have changed, since the bicycle seemed full of eagerness despite the weight, and I felt only the excitement of going to live, very nearly, in Scotland. Though we had settled on the place more by accident than design, it seemed appropriate in an anecdotal sort of way. I liked the idea of a debatable land in the middle of Britain, which was once neither Scottish nor English. My sister and I are the first in the history of our family to be born in England. I grew up understanding the Scots language, but never speaking it, except to tease my father. One of my uncles was an Aberdonian farmer who appeared to be able to speak nothing but Buchan or Doric. Since the dialect was incomprehensible to me, I took it to be a foreign language. In a spirit of compromise, but according to school friends, with typical Scottish wilfulness, I supported the Scottish national football team, and because of my place of birth, Manchester United, whose manager, right half and inside right were all Scots. Living in England, my parents often had to brush off silly remarks about funny accents, atrocious weather, sporrans, kilts, and haggis. At primary school, my sister and I were sometimes corrected for mispronouncing certain words, such as iron with an R. But once we had lost the accent of home, we almost never experienced anti-Scottish ridicule. Instead, our parents made fun of our English accents. I once, only once, referred to my little finger as my pinky, and I tried to keep my middle name a secret. MacDonald had been a tongue-in-cheek homage to my mother's father, a sports reporter in Glasgow, who had discovered in the usual way of genealogical research that an ancestor had been present at, and presumably escaped from, the massacre of Glencoe in 1692, when the Campbells, in league with the English, had exterminated the MacDonalds, that tribe of cattle-rustling Highlanders whose chiefs nonetheless had sent their sons to the Sorbonne. But there was nothing I could do to disguise my surname. The Aberdonian ancestors had sailed from the Norse lands, settling on the farms they had destroyed, which is why the name Robb, with a terminal E, is also found in Normandy. They were undeniably robbers, or as they used to say in the borderlands, reivers. Thanks to an annual migration, otherwise known as a summer holiday, I saw a great deal of Scotland. A day after crossing the border, the Ford Anglia would still be heading north, which proved that my mother was right to suspect the television weather map of foreshortening Scotland. In spite of her endless battle against the English meteorological prejudice, it nearly always rained. Once, probably near Gretna Green, my father took a photograph of his son and daughter standing on the national frontier. At that moment, I discovered the demystificatory magic of borders. One of my legs was English and the other Scottish, but the vegetation was the same, and the rain fell equally on both sides. Much later, in France, I sometimes made a point of claiming to be Scottish. In Paris, at the age of 18, I became friends with an Algerian Highlander, and we decided that one of the reasons we liked each other was that we had a common heritage of heroic resistance, even if mine was purely ancestral. Later still, in La France Profonde, Scottishness, combined with arriving on a bicycle, practically guaranteed a warm welcome. To the inevitable question, "Vous êtes anglais?" I used to reply, "Non, Britannique, et ma femme est américaine." Or, after learning of Samuel Beckett's answer to the same question, "Au contraire." On one occasion, in a remote and unheated hostelry in the Aveyron, the question was asked by the proprietress in a faintly sinister tone. As usual, I declared my Scottish ancestry. "Ah, Écossais," she said, relieved that I was neither English, Dutch, nor Parisian, and called to her husband, "Monsieur est Écossais." Flushed with excitement, she went on, "We didn't realize till a few days ago that the English did to you what the Parisians did to us." I must have looked mystified, since she explained, "Oui, nous avons vu le film Braveheart." Mel Gibson's biopic of William Wallace, who trounced the English in 1297, before terrorizing and laying waste to Cumbria and Northumberland, must be one of the most brazenly inaccurate and tendentiously nationalistic films of the last 50 years. I heard a voice from within, speaking in a distinct Scottish accent. "Serves ye right for trying to cash in on your ancestors." Following the left-right, right-left itinerary of National Cycle Network Route 7, we cycled out of Carlisle through an urban planner's labyrinth of cul-de-sacs and driveways. At a roundabout on the outer edge of Carlisle, northbound touring cyclists can often be seen trying to solve what seems to be the Cycle Network's challenge: reach Scotland without ever heading north. As the Solway Plain opened up on all sides, human habitation disappeared. And still on this major artery of the national network, we found ourselves on the narrowest cycle path I have ever seen. It runs on the old track bed of the Waverley Line and is not much wider than the wobble of a wheel. Tall weeds lashed the panniers, and rabbits sprang from the brambles. It is easy to picture carts and chariots rattling along the former Roman road a few yards to the east, but it takes a strenuous effort of the imagination to visualize a heavy locomotive pulling a passenger train at 50 miles an hour between the rabbity hedges. On the main street of Long Town, a local minibus was taking children to school. The name of the place was painted on the side of the bus in two languages, Longtown and Langtoon, the latter being indistinguishably Cumbrian or Scots. Near the end of the long row of low white houses, before the bridge which carries the A7 over the Esk, two thinly dressed men were sunning themselves on the pavement in front of a hardware store. Perhaps the chilliness of the morning existed only in the minds of outsiders. After Longtown, the road climbed gradually until the few arable fields gave way to rough pasture. Hardly a car went by. In the middle distance there were small farmhouses on hilltops surrounded by enormous barns and cattle sheds, like the outbuildings of castle keeps, as though at night the farmer withdrew into his fastness, leaving the fields to owls and interlopers. In the Solway Plain the land had been vague and indecisive. Now it proclaimed its ancient identities. Just before the summit of the road, where the pasture turned into moorland bog, the view encompassed 4 hill ranges, the mountains of the Lake District behind, the last buttresses of the North Pennines on the right, the hills of Langham and Eskdale to the left, and up ahead, Liddesdale, stretching away towards the Cheviots, where the border follows the watershed line. On a parallel road to the east, a line of white cottages might have been the outpost of a straggling suburb, but there was no settlement beyond. We dropped down into a wood-darkened valley, where the road became a track, and then wandered off into a field of cows. At a distance of a mile, when the trees are bare, a corner of the house and a chimney can sometimes be glimpsed from a particular spot. But even then, the bewildering topography makes it almost impossible to locate. In 2005, the house had nearly burned to the ground, while fire engines from Longtown and Langham roamed the lanes, searching for a means of access. At the Bodleian Library, I had discovered a book published in 1946 in which the wife of a Methodist minister, whose nom de plume was Romany, recounted their first journey out to the border from Carlisle. Romany was an early natural history broadcaster on the BBC. He and his wife had known the house by the river around the time of the First World War, when the tenant, Elizabeth Mitchell, sublet 2 of her rooms to anglers. They had arrived by train on the Waverley line and set off in search of their lodging. Down a steep bank we slid, across a trickle of a stream, and up the other side we clambered, until finally we caught sight of a lonely, whitewashed house almost surrounded by the river. I suppose at one time there must have been some sort of a road down to it, or the house could not have been built, but I never saw any signs of one. No trace remained of the path through the woods. Instead, a thin track cut into the steep hillside ran alongside a crashing burn. Some branches of the leaning trees had been smashed by the removal van, which we expected to see at each bend of the track, wedged into the narrowing tunnel of vegetation. 5 months before, on our prospective visit, everything had seemed cosier and less expansive, and the warmth of the owners had dispelled the intimidation. The babbling brook was now a torrent. Almost at once it plunged into a ravine, leaving the track suspended high above. In its rush to reach the river, it tumbled over crags and rockfalls, some of which had trapped large pieces of rubbish, an old coat bleached by the torrent, and, curiously immobile, an object resembling a large plastic football. We reached a part of the bank where the hazel and willow had been toppled by a landslip to reveal the chasm below. Looking down, I realized that the coat was a fleece, and the football a distended bladder. The rubbish consisted entirely of dead sheep. The farther downstream, the greater the decomposition, until what had once been a fleece was no larger than a face-cloth. They looked like a grisly guard of honor, which had died waiting for the new owners to arrive. The track turned sharply to the right. A sloping, overgrown garden, fleetingly reminiscent.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?